I am completely unconcerned. And in fact, NATO headquarters has published a statement saying that they do not regard what happened with these unmanned systems, these drones, as you call them, as an attack on Poland. That's completely false. I think you've got to be careful when you start connecting these various events. It's sort of like saying, well, Colonel Macgregor, you graduated from West Point in 1976, and since then you've been involved in many operations, some of which people think were unjustified or even illegal. And as a result, we want to know whether or not you think you're a war criminal. It's ridiculous. So adding those events up and trying to make something out of them is a waste of time. I did look at the so-called drones that ended up in Poland. Only one struck anything, and none of them were armed. They seem to have been picked up and through electronic warfare redirected in some way. The Belarusians tracked these drones coming out of northeastern Ukraine or out of northwestern Ukraine headed west. They informed the Polish authorities that these were coming. They actually shot some down, and the Polish authorities then subsequently attacked them or sent up aircraft trying to deal with them. They seem to have actually shot down 20%. But the wreckage that is being examined, there were no explosives. So there was no intention to harm anybody. And it looks like these were simply caught up in this massive electronic warfare environment. I mean, most people don't understand that today in Ukraine, White Russia, Poland, Lithuania, all these areas, there's enormous electronic warfare underway where people are not only trying to track things, but also defeat intrusions. So bottom line is NATO has said, no, we don't regard this as an attack at all. So then the next question comes, why are there 40,000 troops on the Polish border facing Belarus? Because that's what I'm told has gone there. And I got into contact with some of my reliable Polish sources, and they confirmed to me universally, said, this is theater. This is the Polish government trying to play up something that is otherwise meaningless. And it plays to a certain audience in Poland that is still paranoid about Russia. And it's an attempt also to strengthen in some people's minds Poland's connection to NATO. I mean, you can roll all of those things together. But the truth is, there's no Russian threat to Poland. There's no Russian intention to attack Poland. This was not an attack on Poland, as NATO has already stated publicly. So I think we can bury this. It's dead.
Before we bury it, we agree on everything so far. There's only one thing I want to question is the intention behind the drones. So I don't think Russia intended to attack Poland. I remember when I was sleeping, my team woke me up saying Poland's under attack. It reminded me of the G20 during G20 when there was a Ukrainian drone, I think, or anti-defense missile that landed in Poland. Yeah. Everyone was up in arms. Yeah, exactly. It reminded me of that day. There's been a few incursions since. It's expected during the war. But the only question I have has been reports. First, a lot of analysts are saying this was intentional, not to attack Poland, but to test either NATO's resolve for political theater, political posturing, or to test the air defense system in Poland, which didn't do too well. And there's also reports that came out, I'm not sure if you've seen these, that the drones, which were decoy drones, as you said, they had an additional fuel tank, which wouldn't be needed if they were targeting Ukraine. I'm not an expert. Is it a possibility that was not to attack Poland, but to test NATO's resolve or NATO's capabilities or the speed of response?
I'm skeptical of that argument. I'm much more prepared to believe that the Ukrainians misdirected these drones in order to create the illusion of a Russian assault on Poland. That I could believe much more readily than what you just described. As for the additional fuel tanks, I'm unfamiliar with that. Again, I haven't seen the wreckage. This is the first I've heard of it. Again, I'm skeptical of that sort of thing. Sounds like someone's reaching. The business of testing NATO resolve. My question is, what NATO resolve? Who are we kidding? I don't see any evidence that there are any NATO armies mobilizing and moving east. Right now, the French military is waiting to be called into duty inside France against people inside France that threaten the government. I think something similar could happen in Great Britain. And in Germany, they seem to be rounding up everyone who is a quote unquote nationalist who's in uniform and imprisoning them. I don't see much evidence for NATO resolve. So I think there's no reason to test it because it doesn't exist. I don't think Moscow is in the least worried about anybody in Western Europe militarily at this point. And on the other hand, I think it's been made pretty clear by President Trump, even though he continues to say he's going to send more equipment and aid to Ukraine, that he's largely disinterested in becoming involved there and is turning his attention elsewhere.
Colonel, I want to ask you a broader question. It just came to my mind now. We've talked a lot about nuanced discussions about Ukraine war, what's happening in Gaza, Hezbollah. That was our first discussion was prior to the war in Hezbollah when we met in, I think it was in Washington. What's your stance on America's military capabilities? We saw the drills, the military parade in China surprised a lot of analysts in terms of their capabilities. So maybe a more direct question will be, where do you place the US now in terms of military might? And how would you compare it to China and also Russia?
Well, we know that we can sink unarmed, fast speedboats in the open that are otherwise undefended. We've done that in the Caribbean. That's the latest naval victory for the U.S. Navy. Look, I think the United States Armed Forces right now are still, for the most part, what I would call legacy forces. In other words, these forces collectively are a tribute to the Second World War and the Cold War. We're still operating within a strategic framework that is really increasingly irrelevant. What we've done is we've taken some new technologies from time to time, new capabilities, repackaged them inside the existing force structure. I guess what I'm trying to say is there's nothing really new in the U.S. Armed Forces over the last 20 or 30 years that we can point to as evidence for fundamental change in any new direction. These are old force structures, old force designs. Now, when we turn to China, we're seeing evidence for some new force designs. They're now talking about battle groups composed of different kinds of forces. Remember, they've got an estimated 15 to 18 divisions of pure infantry that guard their borders. And they have borders that are thousands of miles long, so that makes sense. But they have no military capability. So if you take that out of the equation, look at the rest of it, you do have now submarines, nuclear submarines that are armed ostensibly with nuclear weapons. And I think the Chinese are developing rapidly in that area. But I think the most important things that we saw were once again in what we would call the rocket forces. And China's emphasis in military development and force design, almost from the beginning, has been to provide forces capabilities that will stop us, the United States Navy, principally and Air Force, from intervening in China. In other words, this is what we refer to as anti-interventionist capabilities or area denial capabilities, denial in the event that we wanted to penetrate Chinese airspace, denial to us in the event that we wanted to assemble a task force off the shores of China and try to invade it. These are the things that we saw. Otherwise, we saw lots of properly uniformed, good-looking young men and women who miraculously marched in step, which is more than I can say for the U.S. Army right now, based upon their last parade on the 14th of June. So I would say we are a glimpse of the past. What you saw in Beijing is a glimpse of the future.
How's that? First, that's concerning. But second, how's that possible when China's spending so much less, reportedly, obviously we don't know the exact figures, on their military development? Are you saying the U.S. Army is just too inefficient? Or am I misunderstanding you? Because you're saying the U.S. Army hasn't developed anything new, but is still far ahead of China, which doesn't have a lot of, they haven't been tested really during times of war. So that's an advantage that the US have because they're over testing their equipment, to be honest.
Well, if you go back to 1910, 1911, 1912, 1913, everyone in the Western world was convinced that the British and French forces, particularly their armies, were vastly superior to the Germans because they had all this wonderful military experience, all of which turned out to be completely irrelevant in the war with Germany. And the German forces during the First World War, I would argue even in the Second, were always superior to the Western forces they confronted and to the Eastern forces. Particularly in World War I, if you go back and look at the statistics, for every German casualty, there were at least 2 to 3 casualties in the French and British armies. even though the French and British armies outnumbered them. I guess what I'm saying is we tend to overrate recent experience against weak opponents as evidence for superiority. That tells you absolutely nothing. Secondly, you got to look at the way forces are organized and how they're equipped. If we look at the rocket artillery, the capabilities that exist in both the Russian and Chinese forces, they vastly outstrip us. We have nothing to compare with it. I was looking at a very recent strike by the Russians in Ukraine on what was a very sensitive target because it contained all of the drone operators and all of the strategic direction being imparted to Ukrainian drones in a part of Ukraine. The Russians tracked it, they identified it, they caught all of the electronic signals, and then they used something that they call a flamethrower. The flamethrower is not really a flamethrower, it's another version of rocket artillery using thermobaric warheads. Thermobaric warheads means fuel, air, gas, explosive. Very powerful. And in the space of a few minutes from various locations, several of these flamethrower systems attacked the site and it was erased effectively from the earth. We don't have those systems in the U.S. Army. Not even close. And our whole air and missile defense network is very weak. Have to remember that for the last 50 years, we've relied almost exclusively on the United States Air Force to provide air and missile defense for the forces on the ground. And that's because we did not encounter enemy air forces that were very capable. I mean, the last time we had really to fight capable air forces was probably during the Korean War, when Russian pilots flew MiG aircraft against us. Prior to that, it was, of course, the Germans, and the Germans had very good air defenses for the time. That's changed now. In other words, technology has advanced, and in both the Russian and Chinese forces, I think you're going to see that in Iran as well. During the next round of war between Israel and Iran, I think you're going to see much better integrated air defenses there as a result of Russian assistance and technological advice. The point is we're behind in those areas. NATO announced just, I think it was about 6 or 8 months ago, that with all of the air defense capability they have, they could protect perhaps 5% of NATO territory. How can you talk about going to war and you can only protect 5% of the territory that you're supposed to be defending? I mean, we are woefully behind in a number of really key areas. We're not even talking about standards of discipline, training, leadership, all of these things.
Well, as a citizen of a country that's allied to you guys, to the US, Australia, that's very close to China, that's not the most reassuring thing to hear. You're talking about, you went back to Russian capabilities. Can you tell me more about the Oreshnik missile? It's got the advanced maneuvering capabilities, which makes it very difficult for NATO to intercept. How concerning is that warhead?
Well, I think it's a very powerful weapon that could have a devastating impact in any war. The Oreshnik deploys multiple warheads accurately against a large set of targets. It's hypersonic. It moves at a speed that we cannot capture and then ultimately target effectively. And as you point out, all of this can be guided. I mean, one of the challenges for us, we've been working on hypersonic missiles as well, is maneuvering a hypersonic missile in flight. It's extremely difficult. They seem to have broken the code on this. So, I mean, you say concerning, I'd be very damn worried right now. I wouldn't want to go to war given the disparity in capability in rocketry and missile technology between ourselves, the Russians, and the Chinese.
Yeah, I remember the day that they deployed it in Dnipro. It was a pretty uneasy day for anyone that was watching. You also referenced what's happening between Israel and Iran, and I've been covering this extensively since the Qatar strike. First, we haven't spoken since the Qatar strike. What was your initial reaction? That was for me, that day was more shocking than when the Iran war broke out, because that's a U.S. ally. I know it's not a new war being struck, but everyone expected Israel and Iran to eventually, potentially get into a war, but no one really expected, at least not me, expected Qatar to be struck, a U.S. ally with the biggest U.S. foreign base, to be struck by Israel.
Well, when this happened, I was a little surprised initially, and I asked the question repeatedly of the experts that I'm familiar with, how could this happen? Was Qatar fooled? Were they asleep at the switch? How did this occur? And ultimately, I was told by people who had worked in the region. These are Americans who've been intimately involved in air and missile defense technology in the Emirates and the Persian Gulf. And what they told me was that Qatar ultimately was aware that the Israelis were coming, because the quality of their air defenses and their radars and missiles are such that the Israelis could not have done that unless there was some sort of agreement in advance that they would not be attacked. In other words, Qatar was in on it. Now, of course, you have, as soon as the event is over, you have all the representatives of Qatar making all the usual speeches condemning, this event and condemning the Israelis and saying this is terrible and awful and on and on and on. But Qatar hasn't changed any of its policies. And as a result, I think probably the Israelis had a behind-the-scenes deal, could well have been brokered by us. The other thing is that initially we tried to act as though we knew nothing about it. Then subsequently, Israeli members of the government admitted, no, the U.S. was informed. Of course we were informed.
Yeah, that makes no sense.
And now we know that Royal Air Force tankers provided the refueling capacity in the air. So the British were involved. I think it's one. Now, these are the technical dimensions of the whole business. As far as the attack is concerned, I think everyone that might want to negotiate with Israel or us is probably going to have second thoughts in the future, because there's no evidence of any good faith whatsoever. Look what happened when the attack on Iran had begun. We were supposedly holding talks with the Iranians, and we acted as though, well, we knew nothing about this. Well, I don't think that's true either. So why would people in the future regard us as a credible negotiating partner? I don't think they will.
Why the discrepancy? That's what perplexes me. Why the discrepancy between what we're seeing in the Middle East, with the points you've made, that what Iran was, even Hezbollah was lured into that meeting where they killed Nasrallah and other leaders. So all these strikes were surprise strikes, very successful decapitation strikes. I think you might challenge how successful they are, but they include some sort of bad faith. One could make that argument. But it's opposite happening in Russia. Trump is opening the red carpet for Putin, meeting him in Alaska, and genuinely seeking peace. Why do you think that we are seeing those two different attempts, unless you disagree with what I just said?
Well, if he were genuinely seeking peace, we would have begun serious talks, and we would be well on our way to some sort of agreement. So I don't think that was ever serious at all. First, you got to understand something. This meeting was something we sought. Witkoff was suddenly put on a plane, shipped to Moscow. Please, please, please have a meeting with us. And the Russians said, okay, because they didn't want to be in the position of rejecting a meeting. But historically, meetings between heads of state are preceded by multiple meetings where the foundations for some sort of agreement are created. And the people that come into the final meeting come in with the final agreement in some form. They may hammer out minor details. But my point is that when you go into these kinds of meetings, you have studied the problem for a long time. You have studied your opponent's proposals, and you have your own proposals. And then you go back and forth until you work out an agreement. None of that happened. So it was unserious. And that's effectively what Vladimir Putin said. He said, it's very good to meet. We're glad we did that. These meetings are always helpful. However, nothing emerged from it. And there was still a failure to listen carefully or pay real attention to what the Russians had proposed. This goes all the way back to December of 2021, when they put together complete proposals for a new security architecture in Europe, a set of proposals that they asked us to examine. We never examined them. We refused to examine them. We hadn't examined anything in detail before that meeting. And I think President Trump wanted to do 3 or 4 things. First, he wanted good optics. This is the reality TV star. This is someone who understands the impact of images. He knows how to manipulate public opinion through images. So he sets this up at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, and he parks on either side of the red carpet all of these advanced combat aircraft, F-22s, F-35s, whatever they were. And then as he's greeting warmly Mr. Putin, Across the sky flies a B-2 bomber with escorts. And Trump is conveying the impression that we are an all-powerful superpower, and that he's now deigning to meet with the president of Russia in order to seek peace. They go into a meeting. It's over in 2 hours. Why? Why did it end so quickly? Because Trump and his team had nothing to propose. Trump thought that he was going to overawe Vladimir Putin with his image, with his glittering personality, the force and power of Trump and the Trump myth, and that something good would come out of this, that he could get the Russians to back down from their positions and agree to a ceasefire. There was no chance of that. Absolutely not.
What's the disagreement? Because I think both leaders do want peace, but they just want it on different terms.
Well, the terms
everyone's debating what those terms are, but
listen, the terms on the Russian side are very clear. They have not been altered in any way. We have never addressed those terms. We keep saying we have to have a ceasefire. We have to have a ceasefire. Everybody's lost sight of the fact that you had a ceasefire in 1918 after you had a long period of negotiations and an agreement was reached. Then you got a ceasefire. You don't get a ceasefire in the middle of a war when there is no agreement to stop fighting. There's only an agreement for a temporary ceasefire. And the Russians have repeated over and over and over again, and in my judgment, justifiably, we want an agreement. We get an agreement, and we have guarantees that people will follow through on what they say, then we'll have a ceasefire. And they have stipulated what's important to them. We have not addressed any of those points. We keep arguing for a ceasefire. When we stop shooting, then we can talk. No, it doesn't work that way. It never has.
There's two other, it's kind of mixed messages over the last few days. You've got the improvements between U.S.-Belarusian relations. Lukashenko, I think, released some political prisoners. And Trump said, after calling Lukashenko a highly respected leader, he said that they're looking at, I think, reopening the embassy or something along those lines. Yes, reopening the embassy. But on the other hand, you've got the Trump statement that his patience in an interview, I think yesterday, said his patience is running out with President Putin. What do you make of these two statements? The way I see it is that Trump seeks peace. He wants a Nobel Peace Prize. He wants to be the peace president. But Putin has, as you said, and I think we disagree on how much upper hand he has, but we both agree he has the upper hand on the ground. So Putin has the upper hand, and Putin has a stronger negotiating position and that's making it difficult for Trump to find some sort of middle ground. Do you agree with that analysis? We have a different take on these two mixed messages: the running out of patience, peace with Belarus.
Depends on which audience he wants to address at any given point in time. He has a tendency to be somewhat schizophrenic when he approaches foreign policy. I mean, he'll say one thing one day and another 2 days later, and people are trying to figure out which one is true. Which direction do I go in? I think we're past the point of dealing with intentions. I have personally never doubted President Trump's intention to seek a peaceful solution in Ukraine. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But intentions don't count for much. That's the first thing. Actions are everything. This man, Zelensky, has treated Trump, in my judgment, with contempt and taken positions that President Trump on his best day could never support. And President Trump, for reasons that are unclear to me, has tolerated it. I don't know why. If you're really interested in peace, and great powers normally are interested in peace because they understand what a great power war means, usually tell a small country under a small leader like Mr. Zelensky to shut up, sit in the corner, and we'll tell you what the outcome looks like. That's what you do if you want peace. President Trump has the power as the president of the United States and the leader of NATO to do exactly that. Or, Mario, maybe he doesn't. Maybe he doesn't have that power. Maybe he doesn't have sufficient backing at home. Maybe he no longer controls NATO. NATO itself is no longer controlled. The globalist leaders in the West are now facing internal revolution at home. They can't possibly back down from the positions they've taken on Russia without complete loss of credibility. If you're Macron, or if you're Merz, or Donald Tusk in Poland. How do you turn around and say, well, I'm sorry, we really didn't tell you the truth. Russia doesn't want to conquer Europe. Russia isn't interested in going to war. We've been pushing this agenda for reasons that have nothing to do with our national interests, but we want to stay in power, because that's effectively what they're saying. Starmer's in the same boat. It's ridiculous. President Trump doesn't have to go that far. He's remote from it. But let's go back to something else that you brought up, which is very, very important. You said, well, Putin has the upper hand, at least on the ground. That's what counts, Mario. The rest of it is crap. Are we willing to fight in eastern Ukraine? Quick, tell me. Answer.
No, not with boots on the ground.
No.
Not with boots on the ground, that's for sure.
We're not going to put any troops on the ground. Absolutely not. We may have 100,000 troops sitting around in Poland and Lithuania and Romania. What they're doing is I have no idea. They don't have any military mission. They're not ready to fight anybody. They're the same old force that we've had for 30 years. They're not equipped for a new and different warfare. Now, we do have headquarters on the ground in Europe, one in Germany, from which we've been directing operations in Ukraine, because the war in Ukraine is really our war. We've just expended a lot of Ukrainian life in the process. But the point is, we're not going to fight on the ground. Are the Europeans going to fight on the ground? We've just had the president of Poland, Nawrocki, the new president, say, absolutely not. No Polish troops will go into Ukraine. Okay. So what are we going to do?
Economic pressure? Let's see, like the last card that the West has, obviously there's no support for boots on the ground. I think we all agree, but the last card is economic pressure. Now, it's debatable how well it's working. It doesn't seem to be working too well. Now it's trying through India, but with India leaning more towards China and Russia, it doesn't look like this is working either.
Well, let's this is a very important point, and you're making the correct assessment. It doesn't work. What we're seeing happen in the world is a split between the Western financial system that has dominated the world, certainly since 1945. We did have this massive change undertaken under Nixon in 73 with abandoning the gold standard. But the bottom line is that we in the West, we're talking about basically London and New York City and Washington, we've controlled transactions, trade, financial operations around the world nonstop. That's ending. And so the world is splitting, and you have on this side now something we call BRICS. And BRICS, miraculously, in the last few years, has developed parallel institutions. They have the SWIFT equivalent that is actually faster, more convenient, and operates better than our own SWIFT system. In the meantime, we are losing ground because major powers in Asia, major powers in South America, major powers in Africa are moving away from us and moving towards BRICS. So we're looking at a split in the global financial system. If you take China, take India and Russia, now start adding Brazil and South Africa, and increasingly, I would argue, much of Africa, period. I think we're going to see the Saudis and others in the Middle East eventually migrate in the same direction. They're migrating away from us, and they're migrating in the direction of BRICS. This is an event that is almost, well, it probably is as important as 1492. And people say, what do you mean 1492? Well, 1492 was the beginning of the end of Ottoman power in the Middle East, because trade shifted. Gold, silver, wealth, power shifted away from the Middle East, and the Middle East was no longer capable of transporting and doing business between China, India, and the West. And the West now had a huge source of gold and income that came out of the New World. This promoted a complete split, and we saw the Western world take off. It took off for many reasons, but now in the Western world, with all of that wealth, there was a huge demand for science and technology and commerce. We're seeing something similar to that happen today. Only it's not because we discovered a new civilization or a new country halfway around the world. It's not because we got to Mars and landed there and found something new. It's because China, India, most of Asia, most of Africa, and increasing large portions of South America are all moving away from us into a new gold-backed system of currencies. And we and our West Europeans, maybe some East Europeans, but certainly West Europeans, are standing around wondering, where are we headed? And where is Australia going to go? Or New Zealand? Where do they migrate? Are they going to sit with us, or are they going to migrate in a different direction? I think all of these things have to be viewed against the backdrop of everything we're discussing. This isn't just about what's going to happen in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is effectively over. The Russians have won. They will determine what happens in eastern and western Ukraine. That's coming. And eventually the people that live on that border, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, and Moldova, they're all going to have to do business with the Russians, whether they like it or not. Hungary knows that. Slovakia knows that. Romania knows that, but they were cheated out of their electoral victory by a globalist. But the globalists are on the run. They're in retreat. They're going to lose power. It'll be interesting to see what happens after that. Now, I can't predict what happens with us, those who are not in BRICS and part of it. I don't know what we'll do. I don't think we can go to a gold-backed system. I'm not sure that we have enough gold to do it. Maybe we're talking about a digitization, digital currency. I have no idea. But what I'm saying is this split is a function of everything happening not only in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East. And if you notice something else, Mr. Trump has made it increasingly clear that he is largely disinterested in going to war with China. That's very important. Remember we had this pivot to China. We have to pivot to China.
Yeah.
It never happened.
And what was Biden's statement? Would you defend Taiwan if China invests Taiwan? The answer was direct yes in that interview.
No.
That was under Biden administration, but it seems now it's less hawkish towards China.
Yeah. Oh, I think Donald Trump wants nothing to do with a war against China. If anything, I think right now in the White House, he and his little band of advisors are trying to figure out how do we get out from underneath this terrible tariff war. You know, this tariff war has done nothing but destruction. You know,
I feel like we're pushing. Let me know what you think of this. It seems that the U.S. is doing this to itself. It's pushed Russia and India to China by through the Ukraine war, by NATO's expansion. It potentially is going to push Arab countries towards China. They're all going to be very upset what's happening in Gaza. And now they're striking Qatar. They're not going to be too happy. All the Gulf countries are uniting. Saudi, the UAE, which are rivals to Qatar, are now standing by Qatar's side. And with the tariff war, it's pushed, historically U.S. allies to kind of seek alternatives. It looks like it's a self-inflicting wound. Maybe we can revert course. I'm saying maybe as in us, the US and allies, maybe we can revert course and kind of fix a lot of those issues. Ukraine war ends and maybe normalize relations with India again, sort out all the tariff issues, normalize relations with Russia. There's hope there. Hopefully the war in Gaza ends soon, doesn't look too good there. And maybe things normalize in the Middle East, but it just keeps getting worse and worse.
Yeah, I think it's going to get a little worse over the next few months because we have a financial system in the United States that is just as fragile as the financial system in Great Britain and the financial system in France and Germany. We're all bound up together in this catastrophe. They're ahead of us. In other words, they're preceding us on the path down to hell, but we'll get there. And it's only when you're finally in hell and you look around and say, gee, didn't want to get here. Now I want to get out. That's when things will change. Now, things will change faster once that decision is made in Europe because they have parliamentary systems and they can toss governments out and bring new governments in and get new leadership almost overnight. We're not organized that way. So it's going to be much harder here in the United States when it strikes.
What do you make of the name change as well from the Department of Defense, renaming it back to the Department of War? Optics, anything meant behind it?
I can't conceive of anything less significant and less important than this. Now, let me back up a minute and explain something, because I know this is important to President Trump, and I happen to agree with him in this sense. He's been very frustrated with an American military establishment that has focused on all of this interventionism and nation building. And it became sort of painfully politically correct. I mean, I can go back 50 years to the decision to integrate women into the service academies and then bringing more and more women into the armed forces. has absolutely done nothing for our readiness or warfighting capability at all. Anybody that's remotely honest will tell you the truth. That's been very, very bad. And if you look at other nations that are maintaining effective armed forces, a good example, of course, of the Russians, they do not integrate women into those formations. They know the risks involved. It makes no sense. And so you have a problem where the young men that we used to set out to attract into the military, they're not showing up. Because you turn to an 18, 19, 20-year-old man who's in reasonably good physical shape, who wants to challenge a military service, who wants to prove himself as a man in his youth. And he's told, well, who are you? You're no good. This little 100-pound female is 5'4", is just as good as you are. Well, if she's just as good as I am, then you don't need me. Mm-hmm. So the whole fabric of military service has been dangerously weakened. President Trump understands that. He's trying to get this war-fighting focus back into people's minds. But changing a name does nothing. I understand what he's thinking. But, I could turn around and say, well, Mario, from now on, your name is Rudolph. You're still Mario, right? It's not going to change anything.
Doesn't make me a German expert.
Yeah, whatever. But, it's silly. It's silly in that sense. But I do understand what lies beneath his reasoning. And he's frustrated with that. That's why he was very frustrated with the senior officers.
Last topic I want to ask you about, something I don't know much about at all. I haven't had time to look into it, and that's the developments in Venezuela. I think you hinted at it at the beginning when you said striking an unarmed boat. The warship has moved off the coast. It looks like military posturing. For me, I just cannot fathom anything happening there. But then that boat got struck. I was pretty surprised. What do you make of these developments, and should we be concerned?
Again, President Trump is very impulsive. And that's what you saw at Elmensdorf Air Force Base in Alaska. It was an impulse meeting. Let's hold this meeting. We'll go in there. We'll talk to them. And I know Putin. I get along with him. We can work this out. Forget it. Had no chance of success. So now, I'm fed up with Venezuela. He listens to Secretary Rubio. And Rubio has been trying to invade Venezuela for years. He says, all right, Rubio, we'll go teach these people a lesson. Let them know what we can do. Okay. How's that work? Venezuela mobilizes for war. The population lines up behind Maduro. Is that because they love Maduro? Not necessarily. But these people have a country. They're proud of their country.
Same with Iran. Same with Iran when Israel struck them.
Of course. So the second question is the legitimate one that you raised is, what are you going to do with, 2,500 Marines and a few thousand sailors? Are you going to nuke these people? That's absurd. So what's your plan? And then we have supposedly groups of mercenaries organized by the CIA, potentially in Colombia or maybe in Guyana. I don't know. And this was all the idea from years ago. We'll have a regime change so that we can put somebody in who'll be our puppet. I don't see that working. So the real question is, what do we want to do? And if you want access to oil and gas, let me explain how you get that in Latin America in a place like Venezuela. First of all, the Chinese have already offered to come in there and try to rebuild and refit all of the oil and gas infrastructure. Mario, we have the best energy experts in the world. We have the finest oil and gas engineers and technicians anywhere. We have a few thousand available right now that we could send down to Venezuela, get Venezuela up and running in months. And that's really what Venezuela needs, because their economy is in terrible condition. The population is suffering. That needs to improve. So what do you do if that's what you want? You want access to the oil. And we think they may have the largest oil reserves in the world. The problem is they're very deep. And we are experts at deep oil drilling and gas. Well, instead of threatening everybody and pouring buckets of filtered abuse all over Maduro because you don't like him, you have a private meeting with Maduro and you say, look, we've had our differences in the past. We'd really like to be your best customer. And in order to be your best customer, we're willing to commit these assets to repair all of this. And oh, by the way, we know that there are a few generals in the Venezuelan army who've been skimming cash off the top of the drug trade. Most of the drugs come out of Colombia. They move through Venezuela, some of them, and then out of Venezuela headed wherever, North, Europe, who knows. We'd like to stop that, and we can help you with these generals, because here's another flash. Maduro doesn't command and control the generals in the Venezuelan army to the extent that he needs to. He has about the same level of influence over the Venezuelan army as the president of Mexico has over the Mexican army. These countries are not like Western countries. You go in there and you offer something and you negotiate with people, and stop talking about changing the government. Stop talking about changing the society. We need to get out of this business once and for all. How many times do we have to fail? How many times have we failed since 1965? Everywhere we've gone to install somebody else and create a new government, only to discover the whole thing failed. But for some reason, this mentality inside Washington persists. And unfortunately, since we're not willing to talk to these people reasonably, rationally, along the lines that I just described, we bring out the hammer. We show everybody the hammer and say, we'll hammer you unless you do what we want.
Yeah.
How large is Venezuela? It's huge. What are you going to do? It doesn't, it's just silly.
Regime changes is, you know, I think we should learn our lesson by now. It just doesn't work. Colonel, absolute pleasure to speak to you. And you know, before ending the interview, you know, it's hard not to mention, Vice President J.D. Vance said in Europe, your enemies within, not Russia. If you remember that statement, that famous speech. And I want to say the same thing, not the same thing now to the US, but something to consider at least, the polarization we're seeing since the assassination of Charlie Kirk. What was your reaction when you first saw it, and any thoughts on it? I'm not sure how closely you're following it.
Well, I've talked to Charlie Kirk in some interviews, and he's a very nice person. He's certainly not a threatening individual. He has a lovely wife and nice children. Now, I do know that he has accepted millions of dollars in support from wealthy Jewish donors. And over the last 30 days or so, he apparently has talked about abandoning the positions that he's held on Israel for a long time. And that may have had something to do with it, but I don't know how you would possibly make that connection. In other words, how do you prove that? I don't know. I am looking at this young man that they found that they're accusing of having executed this. The whole thing looks a lot like Butler, Pennsylvania. What happened there with President Trump, the patsy on the roof that was instantly killed, whose body then was cremated. And we've never found anyone who was responsible for the killing or the attempted killing of Trump. I'm very skeptical. I think in our country, institutions which we have historically revered, like the FBI, in the Justice Department, are now institutions that are no longer credible in the minds of many Americans. So I don't have an answer as to why. I don't think that this is evidence for some widespread readiness to go to civil war. I think you've got a larger problem with just massive criminality. I mean, we've had young women over the last several days chopped into meat, murdered for no apparent reason by people who had already been arrested multiple times and then released. So I don't want to mix apples and oranges, but I'm saying that we just don't know what was behind this with Charlie Kirk.
Yeah. I hope we get the answers.
He was a very decent, honorable person as far as I can tell.
Very nice, man. Very nice, man. Yeah, New York Times did put a correction. They put out an article about his changing stance towards Israel, but they did put a correction that it was taken out of context. He was reading a quote. So I know he's becoming more skeptical of Israel. Personally, I wouldn't link it to the assassination, but hopefully we do get the answers. And I do agree there's no risk. A lot of people are talking about civil war. I tend to be more optimistic. I don't think that's a risk. I do think crime is a risk, but it was a pretty, I'm not sure if you've seen the video. I don't recommend you watch it. It's a pretty heart-wrenching one.
I have.
But Colonel, always a pleasure to speak to you, sir. Thank you so much for your time.